Hello, everyone. I'm Lorna Crochue, and we are gathered this morning for the Diversity, Equity, and Anti-Racism Conversation Part 2. And I just want to ask our panelists where they're coming from this morning, arriving from, or today. I understand in some parts of the country we're past noon, so please feel free to drop in and say where you're coming from live.
Hi, I'm Laura, and I'm coming from the Japanese Hall in Vancouver.
I'm Graham Nickerson. I'm coming from just outside Fredericton, New Brunswick.
I'm Natasha Henry, and I'm joining you from Mississauga, Ontario.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cody. I'm calling in from Ingersoll, Ontario, in southwestern Ontario. And yeah, I'm excited to see a chat feature where all of our guests are coming from as well.
Yes, and Natalie is on the East Coast. Lorna Crochue from Calgary in southern Alberta. And I think we are going to start our conversations. So as a moderator, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement from the ancestral lands of the Blackfoot people in southern Alberta, and also from the Treaty 7 area, home to the Stoney Nakoda Nations, including Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley bands, and from the Tsuut'ina Nation, just outside of Calgary, and of course the Blackfoot Nations, Piikani, Kainai, and Siksika. So welcome this morning. Welcome to the National Trust's Part 2 conversation about diversity, equity, and anti-racism. Today we'll hear from our heritage leaders who happen to be Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And we want to talk about how heritage organizations, heritage sites, and heritage advocates can show anti-racism leadership through their programs, practices, and actions. Again, I'm Lorna Crochue. I'm a member of the National Trust, and I've been on the board since 2015. And I'll be your moderator today, and I'm really glad to meet the panelists for the first time this morning. Before I introduce the panelists, I know some of you are still signing in to join us online. If you can, please say hello on the chat function and state your organization and what you're interested in hearing about today. We also encourage you to use the question and answer function if you wish to pose questions to the panelists as they're presenting. we've also allowed 1 hour for the panelists to present, and we should have maybe about 15 minutes at the end for any kinds of questions. We cannot go any longer than 1:15 Eastern time. So I just wanted to start out by expressing this morning, I guess, the National Trust has been an organization, has been, I guess, an organization expressing historical places and landmarks as locations of dynamic and areas that are alive, essential to sustainable living, and a reflection of the cultural diversity of Canada. For me, as an Indigenous person, I've always been excited to be a part of the National Board, and just so appreciative that the National Board has accepted the Truth and Reconciliation Principles as our guide for strategic planning. For many of us, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, times have changed in the past few months where citizens across the globe are questioning how historic places and monuments are perpetuating racism and discrimination. So it's a very timely conversation and discussions, so I welcome you all to participate as much as you can. Some of you have participated in conversation, in part one of these conversations about diversity, equity, and anti-racism, where the conversations have included mainstream heritage, many mainstream heritage organizations. This session today is about hearing our voices, and because we need to hear more about diversity and understanding how we can do things differently in our circle of heritage, we've called upon these panelists again today. So I'd like to start out by introducing myself, and then I'll introduce the panelists. I'm a member of the Blackfoot Confederacy of Southern Alberta. I work for the City of Calgary, and I'd like to say that I am not only an advocate for the protection of Indigenous sites and traditional land use, I am a practitioner of our cultural ways, and that is how we maintain our language, our traditions, and our customs. Laura Sayamoto is the chair of the Japanese Canadian Legacy Committee and a board of director for the Vancouver Japanese Language School. She's a third generation Japanese Canadian with a BA in history and an MA in sociology. Cody Grote is the director of the Indigenous Heritage Circle, a Mohawk from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, and working on his PhD in history at the Wilfrid Laurier University. Cody is the author of a book titled Canadian Stories. He currently sits on the board for the Chiefswood National Historical Site, and I'd like to hear more about that in his conversations. And he also sits on the board of governors for Wilfrid Laurier University. Natasha Henry is the president of the Ontario Black History Society, is an educator, a historian, and a curriculum consultant specializing in African diasporic experiences. She authored several books and developed educational resources, including resources for the mini-series, The Book of Negroes. She's also a PhD student at York University. Graham Nickerson is a member of the New Brunswick Black History Society, the Black Loyalist Heritage Society, and the Tomlinson Lake Hike to Freedom organization, and a graduate student in history at the University of New Brunswick. He currently holds a Master's of Science degree in engineering and a Bachelor of Science degree. He spends his time engaged in projects depicting the lives of the maritime Black community with the hope of creating awareness of the historical significance of the Black community in Atlantic Canada. So in order to reach and to hear each of our panelists today, we've asked them to present for about 8 hours, I'm sorry, 8 hours. We'd be here the whole entire day on this topic. And I will call them in order as I've introduced, with the exception of Cody. Cody wants to go last. And they will introduce themselves if they wish to introduce themselves more on the topic of their respective work. So I'm going to start out this morning. I have the honor of being the first panelist to speak on this topic, so I'm going to start the discussion. For me, as an Indigenous practitioner, in knowing that our heritage is our way of life, I often think about a colleague of mine who said in a recent interview in response to Indigenous history being left out of Canadian history in general, that Indigenous people are just beginning to write about their history. And on many occasions, it's been written by white historians, and the accuracy and the account and translation of stories are questionable. Indigenous people use oral history passed on through generations, and I don't know how many people understand that oral history, just like academics, has a citing system for accuracy and information. Secondly, oral history goes beyond the oral telling of our stories. It also has an archaeological support to that particular narrative. The archaeology, together with oral traditions, are interactions for sustaining most Indigenous heritage and our way of life, and on our terms. We could not get to sustaining our life and our lifestyles if it's constricted by a colonial structure. So we need to unpack all of it, including names and words, and correct the efforts by truly learning from these Indigenous perspectives. So that's how I'd like to start off as a panel and as guest on this panel. And then I'll turn it over to Laura, and then she can start out with her presentation as well. So Laura, thank you.
Thanks, Lorna. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Saimoto from the Vancouver Japanese Language School and Japanese Hall. And I'm also chair of the Japanese Canadian Legacy Committee, which is a coalition. It's a very loose coalition of all the Japanese Canadian organizations in the Lower Mainland, as well as, historic organizations that steward Japanese Canadian sites in BC. So I'm just going to give you a brief snapshot of sort of what we've been doing over the past several years. And so I'm going to share my screen because it's all photos. So I hope you can all see this. Yeah, so the Japanese Hall is Vancouver's new National Historic Site. And we are a 114-year-old organization that basically has been serving the Vancouver community for 114 years, except for the 11-year gap during the internment and dispossession. So this is our heritage wing, which was built in 1928. And this was one of the only properties that was returned to any Japanese Canadian after the dispossession during the internment. So what we've been doing is really, basically doing activism through education. So here you can see our 1928 building, which we renovated, and we did a heritage rehabilitation, and we launched a child care center inside. So this just shows you a little bit of what we do. And then what we mean by activism through education is like sharing our story. So, the story of Japanese Canadians, the internment and the dispossession, is one of the hidden stories of Canadians. And so we've just been working very hard since really, we've been working at it for many years actually, but we've been particularly focusing since like 2017 when it was the 75th anniversary of the internment. And that's really because, the seniors who had lived through the internment, it was kind of like they were just getting, we were losing quite a few. So we just decided to do a major push. And so at that time, what we did was we partnered with each other, which is totally amazing. We partnered with all the different Japanese Canadian organizations. We worked with the provincial government, and we basically decided to do some legacy education projects. So one of them, the first one we really, that mobilized and unified the community was the provincial government's Provincial Heritage Registry, which listed Japanese Canadian historic sites. So the community mobilized to partner with the government to really drive this project, because we knew that if we got provincial acknowledgement of our sites, then it would be much easier to do heritage legacy projects in the future. So that would be a big stepping stone. The Chinese Canadian community was the first community to do this, and they didn't really get the community behind it. But for us, we mobilized everybody in the community to do it. So we got 56 Japanese Canadian historic sites on the provincial registry. from there, we didn't stop there because we thought, okay, well, we have to use this opportunity to leave historic markers at the actual internment site and road camp locations, which were located, in the interior of the province. So basically, it's been a community dream for many decades to have our history marked at the actual sites, and so that it simply wouldn't be forgotten. So we pitched a proposal to the government as a community. We gave them a budget, we gave them the implementation plan, and so they agreed to do it. And so we partnered with the community and then with the provincial government and with the local communities to install 8 interpretive signs at the actual road camp locations and 3 stop of interest signs. So that took just like 18 months to do across the province. And basically that was like a volunteer committee based with the legacy committee, consisting of very committed members of different organizations within the Lower Mainland, and of course the local communities in the interior. So these are just a few photos of the sign unveiling projects. And what was very important to us was to ensure that we educated the local communities about their own history, which was our history, so and got kids involved. So, we're not living in those places now. So it was very important for us to, transfer our knowledge to the local community so that they would own our history as their history. So that's what we worked very hard on doing. And then this is just a photo of the sort of diversity of the project and how it kind of sprung forth many different projects. So on the bottom left corner, you can see I'm sitting with my family on the stone monument, which is for all the internees in the East Lillooet internment camp. So I'm sitting beside my mother. I'm wearing the red fascinator. And so she was a little girl when the internment started. And so she was, her family was interned in Bridge River and East Lillooet. So this memorial garden was kind of a great offshoot of the whole entire project, where we partnered with the district of Lillooet to create a garden. And that included the signs, as well as we raised $50,000 to create this stone monument. So yeah, key challenges of what's, promoting, history and legacy at the organization level, of course. I think we all have this challenge. It's about capacity. We just have a very, committed volunteer members in our community, like myself, who, drove this project, hoping that it would create capacity for this to continue and be sustainable. Another key challenge for us was owning our historic value, which is something that, very scarred communities and very fractured communities have, it's a healing process. So for us, both internally as individually, as a family, and as a collective, I think it's been a process of owning who we are and our history, and so that we're able to share it. And the other key challenge, of course, is going beyond our ethnic boundaries of community and expanding that definition. So the Japanese Canadian community is only 30,000 in the Lower Mainland. We're a very small population. So how do we be sustainable during these times is we just basically break down the ethnic barriers, and the Japanese Canadian community is now no longer defined by ethnicity or DNA. Another challenge was, of course, the willingness to partner with the outside. We are traditionally a very inward-looking community, and for this to happen, to partner with other organizations and with the government, we need to look outward. And it's really the same at a different scale, with the challenges we had at the organization and the provincial level. is basically capacity and how to partner at many different levels. So how we kind of move through these challenges is, of course, as an organization, we're building financial and program capacity by getting to the point where staff is able to take on these programs. And through this process to really awaken our self-value. And that takes a lot of on-the-ground leadership by community members, relationship building, and also success stories about partnership. And at the community or the sort of more broader level, like at the provincial level, again, it's like, you know, building our own value as a community, that's part of the process. And it's really an experiential process to learn and feel the value of collaboration. So, you know, the win-win partnerships are really feeling the win-win for both, you know, partners or the several partners takes working together on concrete partnerships. So, and projects. So, and then I asked Natalie sort of what you know, we can do for our bucket list to the National Trust and the heritage sector in general. And I think this is my personal bucket list. So is really to speak up for underrepresented voices. Like, you know, we're a minority and we also, we're a visible minority and we're also demographically a minority and cultural heritage is a minority. So we ask the, you know, like larger national organizations to speak up for, you know, like you're doing right now for this kind of thing. The second thing is really to advocate a holistic and conscious lens of history and its value. And I'm finding that with the, you know, the toppling of statues and all of this kind of fight and, you know, we really have to look at history, you know, and including Japanese Canadian history as like, look at both sides. Like it's a complex history and you can't study or learn about one group without also learning about what happened on the other side. So that holistic lens is very important, I really feel right now. And so to really, and to advocate what our value is as a sector, so both the tangible values in terms of the jobs and the economic impact that we bring to our communities, but also really advocating, and this is really because of COVID and over the past few years, I've sort of learned this, is really, you know, putting some, like communicating the civic and really community self-confidence and identity that heritage brings. And that really builds citizenship consciousness. And so I really feel right now that's a very important thing that we can bring to, you know, the rest of the country. I also feel that a transformational approach is very good, and that takes heart leadership. So, you know, anti-racism is fine when you read it in a book, but it actually, for us, it's like learning about our history and putting ourselves, you know, in someone else's shoes. That's the best way to make people sort of feel what happened. And so that kind of heart leadership is like very effective, we feel. Finally, and this is like, you know, Heritage BC has done a great job, and, you know, the National Trust is really facilitating and educating the value of partnerships, especially for smaller organizations like ourselves, to integrate really with other like interdisciplinary ministries, so like small business, tourism, and education. So that's kind of, you know, long term, but I feel that's very important, especially now when a lot of the smaller historic sites are in danger. And so a lot of partnerships is going to be very important in order for us to get through this period. There we go.
Thank you so much, Laura. I have a few questions, but I'm going to keep them to the end. Well, at least one question, but I'll keep it to the end. We'll just go on to Natasha.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be with you. and to share my thoughts on diversity, equity, and anti-racism. So as was mentioned, I'm the president of the Ontario Black History Society. This is my third year in that role. The Ontario Black History Society was founded in 1978. We are a registered Canadian charity dedicated to the study, preservation, and dissemination of Black history and heritage. And we do that through a variety of ways. Today, I'm going to share briefly around exactly what is anti-racism and how has that shaped my work as a professional, but also how our work as an organization as a way to, I guess, provide some clarity and hopefully some ideas or some thoughts for further learning and to help guide your work in whatever role that you may have. So anti-racism, Laura kind of touched on it in terms of a theoretical framework, has some particular ideas as part of it. And I'll just touch a bit on that. With anti-racism, race is a social construct which was established throughout history to create systemic advantage. And oftentimes when we're talking about race, it's often people who are racialized or othered who are identified as race, and whiteness often goes unnamed. In understanding, a critical understanding of race, there's an understanding that whiteness is also raced as well, and that it functions in a particular way. Racism is normal and endemic, and that results in the exclusion of groups of people because of this social construct, and has had and continues to have very real impact on people's individual lives and on the lives of particular groups of people. And there is a role that dominant narratives play in perpetuating both race and racism, as presenting whiteness as the norm and as the dominant focus of representation. And particularly for us, that's relevant as it relates particularly to heritage sites in all their forms, and you know, what stories are often represented and preserved and to the exclusion of others. As well, another important tenet is that racism is an ideology, but it is also very much a structure. That structures our institutions and structures our society as well. And so these are some important premises to understand, to accept, and to embrace if we want to use an anti-racist lens to guide our work to make improvements and to address social justice issues. An anti-racist lens and approach seeks to explain race and racism and to counteract their persistence and their impact. And so as anti-racist leaders, or in striving to become anti-racist leaders, it's important to acknowledge these facts and to encourage ourselves and others to examine our respective structures and practices of racism, and to interrogate power relations, and as well to examine our own social location in these particular dynamics. And so whatever role it is that we are playing, how have we continued to maintain a particular unequal structure? And it could be within our organizations, but also in the broader scope of heritage. And again, we can appreciate that reality because we are, again, engaging in conversations around monuments and around representation. And so, you know, the fact that these conversations are happening, the fact that these monuments, these statues, these markers are being toppled, that there are, again, discussions around them, speaks to, is part of the evidence of this legacy of a particular power dynamic. As anti-racist leaders as well, employing an anti-racist lens to guide our work, and a crucial part of that as well is activism, and that will look differently for different people. And there's, again, having an agenda as it relates to social justice. In examining our leadership roles, our practices, our plans and actions through this lens, it calls for heritage leaders to be intentional in decentering whiteness, to be intentional in decolonizing some of the practices and the representations, and to do that in a critical and informed way. And so, you know, thinking about your programming, are your programs and your materials normatively white? And that to the exclusion of other voices, or how are other voices and other experiences represented and brought in? And who as well are you relying on to bring in these stories and to, you know, to develop these stories? And so another critical look as well is looking at staff, is looking at the experts that you're relying on and bringing in, looking at the leaders that you are partnering with. These are all things for considerations. And I do just want to say as well that when I talk about who are the leaders that you, or experts that you're relying on, it's not necessarily to say that, oh, because, for example, a person like myself is a Black person, then therefore I'm only siloed into being an expert on Black issues. I could be an expert on flowers or rocks or stones, right? But you know, for example, in looking for someone who has knowledge about flowers and rocks and stones, are you considering who also, right, that there's a diversity of people who you can draw on for these sets of expertise and these sets of skills? So that's something to think about, as well as you're looking at, again, the power dynamics in heritage, in the heritage sector. Heritage leaders, we do make value judgments about what is valued. And again, this is represented in exhibits, this is represented in the materials that their decisions are made to hold in collections. This is decided you know, in archives, in terms of whose materials are viewed as valued to be held in an archive. And so there is always a value judgment at play. And oftentimes, for us, because we have a legacy of colonization, that often informs a lot of our practices. And so we have to be intentional in seeing how that continues to play out in order for us to be able to challenge that. The exclusion and the erasure of Black representation communicates a value of Black life. And this is something for me, for us as an organization, that speaks to our ongoing relevance. The fact that in dominant narratives presented, whether it's in the curriculum, whether it's in museums or heritage sites, that oftentimes there is this exclusion and erasure of a 400-year Black presence in Canada. And so that is why our work continues to remain relevant today. In the sense that, you know, these histories and these stories are not woven into the broader narrative of what is Canadian history and what is Canadian heritage. And so, you know, I wanted to end with that because I think part of what sparked this conversation is what's been happening globally, and this upsurge, this uprising of Black Lives Matter, which really is is a continuum of a movement for racial justice and racial equity out of Black communities around the world. And, you know, the phrase of Black Lives Matter really is, it's a statement, and it's also a call to action. And it really is a lens for all organizations to apply. And so if this statement could be true for you, what will that look like, right? And if there are no representations of Black life, that also communicates something to the Black citizenry, to Black residents, to Black communities as well. And so, if this is something where people want to respond to what is happening at this time, what is it that you can do systemically, structurally, but also in representation in order to support this call for the recognition and the valuing of Black life and Black experiences, past and present.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for your presentation. And again, we'll leave questions to the end unless somebody on the panel has questions and something that a burning desire to ask either Laura or Natasha. We'll go on to Graham then. And Graham, if you want to do your presentation.
Hi, yes, Graham Nickerson. I'm originally from Nova Scotia. And so I'm a descendant of Black Loyalists, which migrated to British North America at the end of the American Revolution. And we are considered a distinct society based on our history. And so the debate right now about iconography of Blacks and Black Lives Matter and the real pushback against the historical narrative and current representations of that narrative, really, they link quite closely to our history as Black Loyalists, and that you will not find very much other than the Book of Negroes. We're fairly absent in the historical record of all of the key participants. So our story is, and our issues with our representation is that we're not represented. And so that lack of representation has directly led to what we're seeing today. That the victim narrative of Blacks and how we are subjects as opposed to active players in our own historical trajectory is underrepresented. And there are plenty of examples, which I won't get into now, of where Blacks were key participants in the unraveling of, the playing out of North American history in terms of the ideals of liberty and freedom and the entire, the real problems that the United States face right now in terms of trying to portray their founding fathers as progressive, liberal, populist, but not populist, but an appeal to everyone, which we were never let into the table or to the party. And it's not that it just didn't happen. It was an act of intentional exclusion. So, and that whole theme sort of migrates to Nova Scotia. And so despite the large number of Blacks who migrated to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, some to Quebec, Newfoundland, we're not represented. And so Birchtown, which is the community closest to where I come from, has sort of been indicated as like the capital of Black loyalism. In reality, Birchtown only was a viable settlement for large numbers of Blacks for a short period of time. And then most of them migrated all over Nova Scotia, Canada, and the continent. And so we're somewhat represented in sort of the original community of Birchtown, but lots of other communities, and probably in Ontario as well, had a steady migration of Black loyalists, and then subsequent arrivals of 1812 refugees and other refugees from the US and the Caribbean. And so that whole part of our history, when it's left absent, much like some of the other panelists have and will talk about it, it's hard to understand Canadian or North American history when you exclude something like slavery, considering the colonial powers went to war repeatedly over control of either slave trades or goods that were developed by slaves. So what does that mean? It's a short history lesson on Black loyalism, but basically where we are is we're very early in building our identity. And the development of Black loyalist identity is still in the realm of academics, really. The Book of Negroes sort of took a kick at the can as to portraying a palatable version of Black loyalist history. There were plenty of real Black loyalists that could have been stars of that miniseries. I think creating a fictional person was a bit of a misstep in that we then left all of the other Black loyalists pretty much unacknowledged. But it did raise the issue into public consciousness, and it did put Birchtown in other people's minds. Now the issue is that all of the other communities that had Black communities in them, and some of them are now gone, they're left sort of underrepresented. Places like Halifax do have a Black community, but it's a complicated one of at least 3 different waves of migration, if not more. So again, it all goes back to underrepresentation and a lack of context as to what these Black communities are doing there. And then you add in the traditional racist tropes. Again, you sort of reinforce victim mentality. It isn't that people ended up ghettoized in Africville, for instance. They were forced there. So there is an active element in the greater power structure to put Black people in the margins, and you see it all the way through from the very beginning, and that's how our society unfurled. So really, then looking forward into projects and things that we're trying to accomplish, we need to take a much broader approach to incorporate other Black communities and people who themselves who are in the Black community or the communities in general. They need to take ownership, and you've already heard that spoken. So one of the projects that I was involved in is a living history project in King's Landing, New Brunswick, and that's my background behind me is a pit house reconstruction, which was the original Black loyalist structure that was built in 1783. Just to give you a bit of a context, 1783 was termed the year without summer. My ancestors showed up on the 2nd of December, 1783, from like South Carolina and Virginia. So you can imagine it was a pretty traumatic experience, and it sort of marked itself in our society of the arrival to Nova Scotia in the start of winter. But that puts the structure itself in context, and it sort of, having built one, it's not a simple structure to build. And so there's a lot of further study that can surround a place like this, both academically and it's a popular attraction at King's Landing in New Brunswick. So it portrays Black history. It has a much broader value. And so things like this is a way that we can put Black history in other communities that I noticed that there's someone from Lunenburg, for instance. So Lunenburg, Chester, we're looking at pre-loyalist slave populations that were part of the planter society. And these people, it's a chance to introduce even a small plaque or a site that says Black people were here, right? Because it's countering that absence. We were present, or some of us were. And so that I think looking forward, and anyone who has interest in contacting me out there, we're looking for partners as like you've already heard, outside of our community, inside our community, tangential to our community, and communities within the Maritimes for sure, that are looking to expand on their Black presence. Realize that oh yeah, we did have a small Black community here at one time. It's gone now, but there's enough scholarship and oral history that can relate most people back to the small communities that exist. There are at least 60 or 70 small Black communities or sites of interest in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So that's my spiel. I have there is a project that I put together that I'll provide a link for, so people can explore some of the interesting bits and pieces of stuff that I've talked about. But again, if you want to reach me, you can contact probably Natalie, and especially people who are from Nova Scotia who are interested in trying to tie in the Black Loyalist history through other societies that exist in the province or in New Brunswick, that we look to see how we might do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. Before I mention bring Cody on, I just want to ask Natalie if there's a possibility that you can provide contact information for all the panelists to whoever is requesting. And so you can reach out to these individuals on your own for further information. So thank you again. Cody, we'll hear you, and we'll see after your presentation if we in fact have a little time for a couple of questions.
Sure, I'll make sure to fit in enough time for questions as well. So thank you everyone for having me. My name is Cody Grote. I'm Mohawk from Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve in southwestern Ontario. I'm also a director and the acting president of the Indigenous Heritage Circle, which is a national not-for-profit dedicated to the advancement of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis cultural heritage. I have a chance to speak in the first section of this presentation along with Graham, so I'm going to try to shift my remarks a bit so that I can touch on some new themes. And I really appreciate that Laura and Natasha were both here, because I've learned a lot from them, and I think this session has already proved its worth because they have both encouraged me to think more deeply about what I'm going to present and how their personal experiences have influenced the way I'm going to approach heritage within our organization. And I really do want to start with something that Natasha said, because I feel like it's very important when it comes to Indigenous history. And it was her remark about that race is a social construct. I think that's very important to recognize when it comes to Indigenous history, because although I'm very proud of my Indigenous history and that identity, it's important to recognize that before the arrival of non-Indigenous people, Indigenous racial identity was not a thing. We were people, we had our own distinct nations. This kind of umbrella identity of being an Indigenous person was not in existence. And I think that's really important for us to recognize, because that is the way that we are approaching Indigenous history with heritage organizations today, integrating Indigenous history. But that's really a band-aid solution, and it doesn't actually address the intricacies of the problem in regards to racial diversity in our institutions. We obviously know and acknowledge and accept now that, there's distinct categories of Indigenous identity that are legally recognized in Canada: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And some organizations are building on that idea as well by acknowledging, Métis in relation to First Nations history, for example, in the West. But I think we need to go even farther, and I think that's the next step that's going to be very important for heritage organizations when they're addressing Indigenous history and Indigenous cultural heritage. We need to look at the nations that live within your communities, whose traditional territories occupy your communities, and we need to accept, acknowledge, and appreciate those national distinctions. That's a true way to fully integrate Indigenous diversity and cultural heritage into your systems. So I'm going to use an example from southwestern Ontario, just outside of London, Ontario. And I know we have many people calling in from London today, which is great to see. And it's an example of a National Historic Site that's currently operated and owned by Parks Canada. And I know we have former and current Parks Canada staff on the call too. And this is the South-Wold Prehistoric Earthworks, which is the first National Historic Site of Canada that is federally owned that relates to Indigenous history. It's the first Indigenous cultural heritage site purchased by the federal government for the sake of preservation. This is a former village, a former Attawandaronk village, who are more commonly known as the Neutral, which I'll get into later perhaps as well. But it's really interesting because this village site was occupied for a period of about 50 years in the 1400s. And eventually, the Neutral are now, legally not recognized as a distinct nation because of Haudenosaunee. They had practices including adopting other nations in regards to disease epidemics, to solidified trade networks. The Haudenosaunee adopted a lot of Neutral people into their communities. And then sometimes that was a violent process. I'm Haudenosaunee, I'm going to accept that and appreciate that. But it's interesting because this village in particular, the South Wold Prehistoric Earthworks, we have no historical evidence about why the Attawandaronk left this village site. And in their federal commemorative plaque for the South Wold Prehistoric Earthworks, there's a line at the end that says, the Neutral or the Haudenosaunee are responsible for the demise of the Attawandaronk Nation. Now that interpretation has been challenged for a really long time by the Haudenosaunee and by other Indigenous peoples, because as much as we acknowledge that we did have that role in the current state of the Attawandaronk Nation, we've advocated for many years by saying that's not what we should be talking about in regards to this site. And it builds off something what Graham said, this victim narrative. The Attawandaronk now are represented as being a nation that collapsed, that was in decline due to inter-Indigenous relations. They had lived in this village for a very long time. It was a thriving community, and we need to respect and acknowledge that. But now we just have it interpreted as being this village, and this group is now gone. They're not there. And that's really problematic because it might just be a passing line, and it is, a historically accurate fact, but the way that they're interpreting it, the content they choose to interpret still presents this very intense victim narrative. And we need to recognize that when we're talking about Indigenous sites, every word that we choose is very politicized and very intentional, and we need to kind of trace out those meanings. And I want to build off something that Laura and Graham both said about building on the relationships with other organizations and other communities, because I feel for Indigenous history, that's very important as well. It's not just nation-to-nation history in regards to Indigenous peoples that we should look at. For example, the example I used is South Wold Earthworks, the Attawandaronk and the Haudenosaunee. We can look at those different relationships between those distinct nations, but also with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I'm going to use an example from Ontario that I think Graham and Natasha will also kind of find interesting because it builds up their relationship. So my last name is Grote, and that comes, the farthest we can trace it back is Michael Grote, who was a Black loyalist who came from Ontario. He got a land grant. He was a former slave in America. He got a land grant, and he formed a settlement. He was, friends with Richard Pierpoint, and there's this issue where they had all of the Black citizens who got land grants in Ontario, but were spaced far apart geographically. They didn't know that that was going to be the case, and they were often given the worst tracts of land. They wanted to be together to build a community, but that was not the case. So Richard Pierpoint, who's a very important Black Canadian figure, drafted a document in the 1700s, the Petition of Free Negroes, and they said that they would like to build a community together. That never happened, but Michael Grote, my ancestor, eventually moved in the area close to what became Six Nations, and then my family, after Michael Grote, is a very Indigenous family moving forwards. But we need to look at those intersections. Black Indigenous communities were a thing. For many years, even, Black Canadians moved on to reserves or into Indigenous communities because there was less, they were faced with less racism, less explicit racism when they were in these communities. And, we need to build on these. And Laura made some really interesting points about needing to mark, these former internment camps. But it's really interesting as well because we know that the areas where these internment camps were traditional Indigenous territories, and the Indigenous people weren't there anymore because they were also displaced onto reserves. And past systems are in place. They weren't allowed to leave their reserves. And in the early days, there was a lot of this mentality as well of keeping Indigenous peoples there. So I think it's really important to build these relationships and to realize that Indigenous history is not just one umbrella. It's not Indigenous history. It's hundreds of distinct Indigenous nations and communities. And also realize that Indigenous peoples didn't just have meaningful relationships with white or European societies. We also had very important historical relationships with the Black community, with the Japanese community, and it's really important that we commemorate and acknowledge those relationships as well. And I didn't think I was going to be presenting about any of that at the beginning of this call. So I thank everyone for kind of sparking my interest and imagination. And I'll give it back to Lorna.
Thank you so much, Cody. And so I have to start wrapping it up in a little bit. I think maybe we might have a time for one small question. So if there's any sort of a desire to pose that question from the audience, and now is the time. If not, I'm going to go on to, okay, looks like, let me just check this, please. Just give me a moment here. Question for Graham. Were you aware that the OSEF and OBHF traveled to Nova Scotia in July 2018 as part of a reunion with the Africville? This included tours of both Birchtown and Shelburne, and we absorbed a great deal of your local history at the time. Please reach out to us for further. So that's more of a comment than a question. I'm very conscientious of time because we told everybody we'd be off the conversation at about 1:15. Just sort of a summary, and I think in my observation of all the panelists and their presentations, and starting with Laura, I guess Laura, you talked a lot about how heritage builds self-confidence within that social construct. So again, back to Natasha saying race is a social construct, and it has many advantages. And Graham, again, your conversation around identity and how identity continues to be formed through historical presence. And Cody, again, your reference back to Natasha, race is a social construct. And whereas Indigenous people, we all are distinct nations, but these are really important conversations because I go back to my opening statement that our heritage is part of our way of life. It sustains us, and it sustains us in a way where it provides self-identity. So for me, as a Blackfoot speaking person, it sustains my language, my spirituality, my culture, and my traditions. If we did not have those 4 components within our heritage, then I'm not sure if we could sustain ourselves as a Blackfoot population. And I know other Indigenous populations feel that same way. And I think as we look on the landscape, those Indigenous monuments are our way to go, are our ways in which we can go and practice our language, our spirituality, and our culture. And sometimes those Indigenous sites are not recognized as heritage. So there's a great deal of effort that needs to go on in terms of these kinds of conversations, again, because of that identity and that self-confidence that it represents. So I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that particular subject. We still have 5 minutes, and I would like to express that from as my point of view, but if anybody else wants to weigh in on that too.
Oh, I see there's a question for me. I'm just going to read it. I feel like the other term is French, and I'm just not a French speaker. That would be my answer to
Okay.
Lilia's question.
Mm-hmm.
Lilia's question? Yeah. Yeah, nothing in particular. But it's always interesting because that's one of the things I really do appreciate with Indigenous history, and I feel Lorna will agree. There's, within the realm of Indigenous cultural identity, there's been a lot of change in the names that we use to identify ourselves. And I feel that's really important. Calling ourselves Aboriginals, calling ourselves First Peoples, Amerindians was a term for a while. Indigenous is what's used now. And I think that's great. I think there's going to be more change in my lifetime. And I am looking forward to that. And I'm excited for that, because what I believe it is, continual efforts to reclaim our identity and decide our own identity and our own cultural heritage. And I think that's really important and really great. So as I move into the future, will I refer to myself as an Indigenous person? Who knows? We'll see. And I think it's just exciting for us to see that and learn, because it's always going to be an act of reclaiming our identity and our heritage.
Lauren, I'd like to sort of comment on your comments. And I think from what I've experienced in our community and going through, the process of, marking our history, mobilizing the community, and really celebrating our history and owning it so that we're able to share it. Just leave you with this. It's like my mother, like in terms of how that heals trauma within the individual and the collective, is massive. And just so you kind of get an idea is, my mother, who was a little girl during the internment, we took her to a couple of the events, and, she's worked in the community her whole life, but it was very obvious, like after these events, like she had her light inside literally shone brighter. And to me, that was like so worth it. Like so yeah.
Yes, thank you. And I believe with Indigenous people, there's a lot of healing that has to happen because of our colonized history. And so I think what you're saying is really important to the Indigenous community as well. Anybody else want to weigh in on this last minute?
I would just say that, in terms of, all of these elements are core foundational ideas as it relates to heritage for all people. And so when we talk about, as it relates, for example, to that identification with a heritage, with a language, with a past, these are things that are crucial for positive development of our young people. And so when we think about, for me in the work that I do, with Black youth, how heritage and history are important pieces for people to develop a sense of self, a sense of belonging, a sense of place. And so the ongoing erasure contributes to that self-identification that Graham talked about, and that sense of community. And so these are very important. And what I would want people to take away is that, the question is, how can we all contribute to fostering that sense of self? How can we challenge the systems of exclusion and erasure, and really look at the complicated histories and interactions that we have here in Canada to present a more fulsome story? I think this is important work that all of us have to work to do and to improve for future generations.
I think just really, Lorna, I know you're going to kick us off, but I would encourage everyone to like the social media pages for the Ontario Black History Society. I know they have an event page. The New Brunswick Black History Society has a Facebook page. Laura, I'm not sure if your organization does. I tried to find it. And Indigenous Heritage Circle has a Facebook page and a LinkedIn. Follow those to learn how you can do more. Sorry, Lorna.
That's okay. Maybe you can send those along, Cody. And
I'll get Natalie too.
For that closing challenge, Natasha, that's an absolute big challenge for all of us. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it back to the next session. Emily and Natalie, if you have something to share. There we go. And I'm so appreciative of all the panelists and the discussions. And hopefully we can close by saying there's more to come. So take care, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.